Hello, my name is Zayaan. I'm very excited to be one of the speakers as part of this Food Dialogues version 2. Very different to version 1 with our online socially distanced platform. And I'll be speaking on food and cultures. I'm going to read the initial write-up and then go into the discussion or the talk that I've given. So forgive me, I'll be a talking head, but I hope that this will encourage a lot of discussion when we have the opportunity to do, a panel discussion and the Q&A. So here goes. So Cape Town's food culture or cultures, often regarded as a veritable food haven, the city not only has a strong Malay influence, but also a rich multicultural heritage that heavily influences its cuisine, whereby flavors, styles, and techniques are fused. The diverse food culture of Cape Town is one of many fundamental components to how people socialize in the city. With movement in the city being less than what was considered normal, Cape Townians find themselves having to rely on recipes from various sources to cook cuisines that form part of Cape Town's food culture. It is difficult to determine when Cape Townians will experience the city's rich food culture again without the stress and anxiety of the COVID-19 pandemic, as health and safety should be priority over socializing. Right, so we know that Cape Town has been cosmopolitan for many moons. The Khoi are known for being linguists. We look at the woman we now call Kratoa as an example of this, who was an interpreter between the Dutch and Khoi peoples. But we also have to take ourselves kind of back to the interactions between indigenous peoples and all the various travelers that predates colonization, right? Various visitors from Arab travelers, different traders from the continent, survivors of shipwrecks that integrated themselves into societies here. Okay, but subsequently, colonization is what erupted our city into what it is today. Culturally, societies are largely descendants from many thousands of slaves brought into the Cape from the VOC colonies around the world, the Dutch East India companies. And these colonies around the world from Madagascar, and then also on the continent like Guinea and Ghana, and then Indonesia, which then was Batavia, and also the Indian subcontinent, kind of Sri Lanka region and so on. And eventually slavery, took a hold within the indigenous peoples, the Khoi. So these histories we know are deeply tragic. Families, identities ripped apart and kind of reassigned, and a lot of cultural elements embedded themselves within the landscape through these people and their relationship with the land. So, and from like what I'm talking about is specifically knowledges around fishing in the oceans, utilizing different spices for different uses, the myriad of felt medicine, and like even into the never-ending domestic needs, like the cures for bored children, or basically how to resist colonial control. So some of this still exists within the recipes today, and within the foodways and many rituals that are associated with food. So the Cape has a particular flavor different to the rest of the country, and it's largely identified by or as Cape Malay cuisine, but it's multifaceted. And as an example of this, I usually use the example of District 6, where you had, excuse me, a very multicultural, integrated society where food was a very wealthy thing in terms of there was always enough to eat. And you hear stories of, like my grandmother used to wake up for her morning prayers and start the oven and the stove at that time was a coal stove, and put a big pot on the stove and be able to cook for whoever needed food. So whenever, you know, all the family members, but whenever somebody passed by or asked for food, there would always be food available. And stories of, you know, multicultural neighbors sharing different foods to the point that we understood each other's food ways. We were not separated from different cultural foods because people lived together. So there were also these, you know, crossings of where different cultures would share the same food. And pens or tripe is one of them, with different maybe different ways of making the same food kind of ended up in similar tastes. But what then happened is, with forced removal, and very tragically, when people were forced, now separated from being integrated, now having to live within the same racial group, for example, you didn't get that integration anymore. And so we separated, but also separated culturally. So we weren't privy to other races or other cultures, food types, which is a great tragedy, and has created a lot more kind of unfortunate separation that is now inherited, you know, and could have been avoided were it not for forced removal. But of course, so we know colonial influence is still something wholly obvious in the city, and something Cape Town can be famous for. It shows itself in our food and social environments within hospitality industries, as well as in the publication houses and organizations, different restaurants and cafes, and of course, the many, many large-scale farms that still exist all over the region. And we see this in the treatment of farm workers. We see this in the lack of general support given to small-scale fishers over large industrial fisheries. We see this in the ill treatment of the Bosi doctors as having kind of lesser knowledge systems than Western medicine doctors. We see this in the treatment of restaurants staff, front of house, back of house, of young chefs, and Black staff in general. But yet it's true, Cape Town's cuisine, it suits the locals, but also is able to entice foreign palates, right? There is always a little something for everyone. So somehow, through all of this difficulty, Cape Town has become quite famous for its food scene. But now, cut to 2020. And with it, we've had this surge of epic, epic tragedies around the world, from the fires in the Amazon in Australia, the continued annexation of Palestine, continued police brutality, and murdering of Black peoples, even worse now during lockdown, both here and around the world, as well as the potential for martial law. And so now, with the reality of COVID-19, we are being governed by this invisible, if I can call it like a half life force, this virus that brings with it a constant reminder of our mortality. Many of us have lost loved ones because of this virus and in this time, and not being able to have our final goodbyes or have closure. We are riding waves of anxiety, constantly navigating if things are sterile enough, if they're clean enough, and you know, obviously this affects our relationship to one another as well. I mean, of course, it's truly affected our social lives, and as well, in terms of this discussion, our relationship, or as, you know, looking at food spaces as socializing or gathering spaces. So this virus and subsequent lockdown has had both peculiar but also devastating effects on our city. Lockdowns have taken work away from so many Capetonians across all industries, and social food systems that usually are in place were abruptly stopped. So, for example, like school feeding schemes, as well as homeless shelters. So community members then stepped up, and soup kitchens and individuals making big pots of food to feed communities, but done in a socially distanced way. And then, of course, we saw the rise of the community action networks, which have been largely successful, and they've managed to feed even more, managed to channel a lot more food by being also registered, for example. And all of these systems are growing and continue to do so. So when we talk about the peculiar elements, I'm talking more about the kinds of things that have emerged on social media. So, for example, initially we were all making pineapple beer and pineapple soda, and fermenting things and pickling things and storing things and trying our hands at sourdough. So sourdough blew up globally. It became quite a phenomenon. But these social network influencings like truly speak to that validity that food can offer in this notion of contemporary trends. So this idea of how things are trending and what kind of the connection that has to the capitalistic notion of success. So in influencer culture, food, when done with humility, can be forgiving in its nature, right? So it's something tangible to connect with, especially in these exceptionally trying times. And for those who are able, food became something we could get lost in, something we could improve our skills in, we could find joy and inspiration when everything felt uncertain. And this also encourages, solutions for the dreamers, for food dreamers. So I'm going to give the example of my friend Purusha Naidu, who is a food artist, and she has these adventures on Instagram where she's a traveler at heart, right? She's been very blessed to be around the world, and she, in this time of lockdown, her solutions to travel the world, she does through Instagram, through her kitchen and the internet. And she also has this movable restaurant that she pops up on the mountain at the seashore. So being kind of looking at solutions to kind of encourage the reasons why we go out to eat. How can we bring that into our own spaces through our own creativity? So this idea of taking inspirational matters into Purusha's own hands while sharing this with an online community allows for small moments of hope that could sow seeds for bigger joys and inspire other people, right? So this recent lockdown that South Africa has been placed under has also had various effects around the city, and most notably that because of the very fine margins that most restaurants operate under, many have had to close shop, Cape Town institutions, and recently protests have started using the hashtag Jobs Save Lives. So, and to share how many people have thus far lost their jobs, lost their work in the hospitality industry, and as a kind of knock-on effect, how many dependents have been affected by this job loss, this huge job loss and closing down of businesses. So, and while this is true, we have to take note of this, the rampant mistreatment and racism of restaurant staff, which is also synonymous with restaurants around the city. And when we see solidarity in these kind of protests, we have to be critical in whether or not this moment is an opportunity for a much deeper change, or if it's just automatically going back to business as usual, which is the more comfortable and I guess more obvious kind of track or destination. But hopefully what is happening is this kind of potential to shift the system by being unpredictable, by being inspired by the forced change that is upon us, and creating new connections that may be truly transformational, as we hope. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I look forward to our continued discussions.